Destiny's Cosmodrome. It's based off the real-life Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan if it had progressed 30 to 40 years into the Golden Age. The Cosmodrome is Bungie's fantasy of what humanity would have done with the Baikonur Cosmodrome given unlimited global resources and space magic from the Traveler. The design theme was if you took a giant G.I. Joe base and mixed it with a space launch facility, this is what you'd get. During pre-production for Cosmodrome, there were concept artists working on inspirational shots called postcards. An image that encapsulates or is iconic of a whole place, combining everything that you want in a single image. Tanks, space program stuff, a cloudy blue sky and snow on the ground. This was the essence of the Cosmodrome. Pretty much all concept art came from this one postcard. Dock 13, or The Hangar, as it was known during production. An important thing that this space does is that it separates the steps from the divide. They're both really big areas, and when Destiny shipped on the PS3 and Xbox 360, there was no way Bungie could get those two areas to be adjacent to each other because of memory constraints. So one of the reasons this space exists is to provide a technical memory buffer between those two areas, as well as being a choice reveal spot for the Guardian ship. Speaking of the ship, the original idea was that you would be in the Cosmodrome, kind of helpless walking around with nothing except an old gun. And you would happen upon this ship that might be able to get you back to the tower. It might just limp its way back through the low atmosphere and get you back to safety. The ship belonged to a Guardian who was stranded long ago. He attempted to make repairs, hence the cables and terminal underneath. Obviously, he failed, however, and no one knows what happened to him in the end. The Divide, or the Graveyard, as it was known internally, was once upon a time going to be littered with civilian vehicles and tanks. It was the scene of an epic battle between the Cosmodrome's paramilitarized security forces and the panicked civilian population trying desperately to get on board a colony ship. This was toned back, however, as they couldn't afford to have that many civilian vehicles in one space for performance reasons. Instead, they opted for a few tanks, as seen here. Now, with the tanks, you'll notice they're not extremely futuristic, but it does look like something you'd see in maybe 20 to 30 years. There's extra electronics on the top and a few futuristic looking optics, etc. The Cosmodrome is supposed to feel relatable and grounded in contemporary imagery, themes, and technology, but also a little futuristic, so that it could have been something around our time, as well as having progressed a little bit further with the Golden Age. The giant dividing wall seen around the Cosmodrome was erected during the latter stages of its existence before the collapse. When the collapse of humanity was happening, you would have had millions of panicked civilians trying to escape the onrush of the darkness in the hopes of boarding a colony ship, one of the last means of transport leaving Earth, although they never actually took off in the end. When players first start the game, they walk through a field of abandoned cars. These were the civilians trying to get into the base. Most never got in, but some of them did, causing quite a bit of chaos. A note on the highway cars is that they're a little bit futuristic and a little bit contemporary. Bungie wanted to design vehicles that would still be relatable 20 to 40 years from now. During the Golden Age, humanity didn't invest in better looking Ferraris, semi-trucks, or sexy new office buildings. What we got was humanity coming together, building these space vehicles and colonies. The progression of regular towns, cities, and vehicles around Earth slowed, while humanity poured its resources into the colonies and space exploration. Here's a before and after shot of the highway outside the Cosmodrome. The before shot was loosely sketched together by Rob Adams, the lead world artist for Destiny. After 30 to 40 redesigns, a few years of time, thousands of hours of work between concept artists, skybox artists, hard surface 3D modelers, environment artists, shader artists, and texture artists, we have the final game space. Going back to the chaos I mentioned a minute ago leads us to the refinery. Now, the rockets and colony ships had to be fueled by large amounts of fuel. This fuel was so volatile and dangerous they couldn't risk transporting it into the Cosmodrome. So as a result, they refined and mixed it right there in the refinery. When panicked civilians eventually overran the base and chaos broke out, there were fires, and there was a point at which the fuel lines exploded, and when they did, they left a huge crater in the middle of this space, known simply as the Blast. The ship destined for safety never took off, and as a result, it sits above the Cosmodrome and is packed full of mummified corpses to this day. Right between the steps and the moth yards is a wide ditch. What this ditch really is a transition. A transition is a space between two spaces where you load one and drop the other. So instead of a narrow hallway transition like Dock 13 between the steps and the divide, the team created a wide dip to maintain the wide open feel of the first two areas in the Cosmodrome. Lore-wise, this is actually a giant water spillway. So when the colony ship was to take off, the giant doorway would open up and all the water would spill into the ocean filled with ammonia, hydrogen peroxide, and various other toxic chemicals found in rocket fuel. Rip the environment dream. Skywatch is the facility where humanity would have done most of its day-to-day communications with the colonies, talking about things like transport, logistics, and mission control, which is why you see so many domes, arrays, terminals, and servers. And scattered throughout Skywatch is the word that reads POBA in English. The proper pronunciation would be in Russian, and it stands for the Russian Federal Bureau of Aeronautics. The reason the company's graphics have a retro feel, along with the futuristic technology of the Cosmodrome, makes it feel like POBA had spanned a century or two. Heading outdoors into the height of Skywatch is where the communication facilities are all connected. It was inspired by images of communication bases in the Arctic. Also, because the elevation is higher here, there's more snow than anywhere else in the Cosmodrome. One of the reasons there's so much elevation in the Forgotten Shore is so that the rocky outcroppings and ships can block your sightline across the space. This is actually for a technical purpose. At any one time, you can never see too many objects in the space, so the frame rate doesn't drop. The game's engine doesn't render about 80% of the large objects that are hidden from view in a single space. The entrance to Rasputin's lair found atop the Forgotten Shore also underwent many design changes. Eventually, they settled on this concept art by Dorje Belbrook, which was inspired by old Scottish castles. What surprised me the most about Destiny's Cosmodrome is the number of parallels between it and the real-life Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The Baikonur Cosmodrome really is the world's first and largest operational space launch facility. So it makes sense that if the world was to choose one place to pour its golden age resources into for space exploration, this would have been it. It's located in the desert steppe of Kazakhstan, and what's the first location we spawn into in the game? The steppes. The Baikonur Cosmodrome is owned by the Russian government and managed jointly by the Russian Federal Space Agency and the Russian Aerospace Defense Forces. In Destiny, it's run by the Russian Federal Bureau of Aeronautics, almost like it's a mixture of the two names. The Aral Sea is a real place roughly 200 kilometers west of the Baikonur Cosmodrome. In Destiny, it's been brought right alongside the Cosmodrome, and actual photographs were used as inspiration to design the Forgotten Shore. Very little concept art was used here because there was so much perfect photo reference that mirrored exactly what the team had envisioned for the space. The name Forgotten Shore itself could be a loose reference to the abandoned ships scattered throughout the Aral Sea, long since forgotten by their crews. And finally, the rusted planes found throughout the moth yards are based on the real-life Antonov AN-225. This was a strategic airlift cargo aircraft designed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, specifically to transport space planes, so it makes perfect sense for that to be the style of plane used during the Golden Age, before the collapse of humanity.